Thanks ever so much for coming. Can you hear me at the back okay? Great. I'll talk for just over half an hour. I'll show you a lot of pictures. A few of them are fairly complicated. Most of them aren't, I hope. You're all interested in geography. Geography keeps changing as a subject. It's very different to the subject it was 100 years ago. Very different to the subject it was when I was at school. I had to write about the Ice Age which was coming if I wanted to get a high mark in my A-level. Right? So you can guess how old I am from that. But certainly there'll be things that we say now that people will laugh about us doing. And this will change. It is very different in schools than it is at university. And at university it tends to vary dramatically between different geography departments. I don't think it's very brave to say it's going to change more. I think geography could be more interesting than it currently is. I think it would be good if it was, because that would be good, of course, for university geography departments, but also for geography teachers, and not least for people studying geography. I think the subject could be a lot more about the future than it currently is. This is kind of our territory. It's partly become our territory because of climate change, which is all about the future, and is definitely here to stay for quite some time. But there are a whole lot of other subjects which you can suggest are geographical. I've written a book, I'll show you the front cover of it in a minute, which has a teasing title. It's called The Next Crisis. So it's designed to get people to buy it because they want to know what the next crisis is going to be. And just so I don't feel so guilty, it doesn't actually tell you what the next crisis will be. But there'll be a geographical aspect to it, whatever it is. These are the billionaires, some of them, that we tend to worry about. I like this picture because they're very human. They're not a different species. They're not super intelligent. Their ideas are not particularly special. I like the fact that they're glued to their screens, in most cases, in what they're looking at. Okay, let's move forward so I don't take forever. And there we go. Feels misbehaving. And there's going to be quite a lot that is partly political in this, because politics is interesting. Crisis. The word crisis. I haven't got any time to do a poll, but I suspect if I got you to put up your hands and say whether you think we're living in an age of crisis, and particularly crises ridden at the moment, most of you would probably agree, and you have quite a lot of fear for the future. This is a simple Google Ngram, but the same result is found in different languages than English, but English is the main one that's used. It goes from the year 1800 to 2019. And it's the frequency of the use of the word crisis in publications in the English language. Now, that earlier century and a half wasn't a happy time of happy peasants dancing around maypoles, okay? There were an enormous number of pandemics, far more than we get nowadays. We don't get many pandemics nowadays. There were wars, there were bad harvests, there was starvation, there was lots of things which were not good. But we didn't talk about crises. In fact, we didn't even talk about crises much, although it increased in the 1930s. It's the 1960s where it ramps up. And you might think Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. But then it ramps up again in the 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s, and just up and up and up. So we've been living in an age of crisis for most of us for all our lives, where we talk about endless crises. I like the fact it ends in 2019, because you just know that when somebody updates it, it's going to go off the scale. If you can remember the early months of 2020, right? So there's no way it's over. The interesting question is, why now? I'm an optimist. One optimistic take on this is that there are enough of us now in the world able to read, able to buy books and magazines, to worry about things enough that we actually worry about crises in a way that we didn't before. It's also been a time of relative peace in the world, but we're very, very worried about the future. I'm going to show you the biggest crises that people worry about in a minute. Economic instability and the billionaires. This is my current big worry. There isn't much text, don't worry, on later slides, but here's some. The kind of latest shock horror is Donald Trump and the USA. 5 of the 7 richest men in the world stood behind him in his inauguration. It's kind of a giveaway. You know, if you wondered who it is that Trump represents, they're kind of making it easy for you. But their lives are not absolutely certain. Their wealth goes up and down. It's enormous. Elon Musk's wealth is equal to the combined wealth of the poorest 50% of people in the USA. In the future, there'll be a word for this. A society in which you allow a tiny number of people to be so very wealthy. And so one of the fears we have at the moment is, what are they doing with their wealth? What are they doing, in particular, as we're all in England at the moment, what are they actually reading on their screens? What is their interest, say, in England? Let's go forward. There's the cover of the book. And it contains a fair amount of data, trying to put worries and concerns and crises into order. There's actually a global business in worrying about crises. There are risk managers that major companies hire. They meet at Davos, and every year they produce a report about what's the worst thing going to happen in the coming year. And quite often it doesn't happen. It's not bad. What I'm going to show you a bit later is the kind of worries that people worry about. But these graphs are about some of the good news, because this is wealth inequality. It's the share of wealth at the top 1%. And although in general it's risen since the 1980s and 90s, it's incredibly low compared to the past. In all these countries, USA, UK, Sweden and France. The very wealthy are a much smaller group than they used to be. The multimillionaires are not doing as well as they used to be. A few billionaires are doing very well. Or to take you back to an example from the UK, the best off third of people in the UK roughly saw their wealth double between 1979 and when Margaret Thatcher resigned about 10 years later. Right? So a third of people, most of them had voted for the Conservatives in 79 and in 83 and in 87 and in 92, actually saw their own position, their financial position, get better. That no longer happens. We no longer have a substantial group of well-off people getting wealthier. It's a small number. Ipsos Mori, for many years now, have been polling many countries, over 30 countries in the world, and asking people every month, what of 18 issues are their top 3 concerns. So I looked at a lot of different ways in which you can worry about the future, and what I really like is the Ipsos Mori poll. I think it's the nicest one. Now, it's supposed to be a cross-sectional poll of the population, but in effect it's a poll of the middle class of these countries, because poorer people tend not to fill in polls. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences have done a very similar poll for at least a decade. Ipsos includes India, a few countries in Africa, a few in South America, a lot in Europe. So we have the majority of the world's population here. And the worries do vary a little bit over time, but not that much. And the top 2 worries in recent years have been inflation, cost of living, and poverty inequality. Poverty and inequality was the highest worry before the cost of living crisis began during the pandemic. So you can put those top 2 together, and very clearly get a number one worry in the world that people have, which is often not realised. You may have thought that the biggest worry in the world was going to be climate change, but it isn't the biggest worry of most people. It is the biggest worry of young university graduates across Europe, but not of most people. Climate change is the biggest worry of people who are pretty rich and sensitive and understand, because they don't have to worry about cost of living and so on. So those are the first biggest crises. Cost of living, inflation and poverty. How am I going to get by? And it's roughly the same in this country. The second biggest crisis is unemployment, work. Who's going to want me? Who's going to need me? And it was a shock for me to see this, particularly if you think about somewhere like the UK with a very low unemployment rate. Why is it such a big worry? But I bet you the school children in the audience here, in the back of many of your minds will be, what am I going to be doing in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? Who's going to want me for what? If you work in a university in Britain, odds on you're going to be worried about, will I have a job? If you're not that near to retirement age. It's an incredible, pervasive, prevalent worry is the fear of unemployment. And it is often not realised until you actually ask people what their concerns are and they tick it. Now what I've done is I've put some of these worries together, and I've put immigration and the worry about immigration along with unemployment. The idea that they're going to come and take our jobs. So we can talk about that a bit later, if you like. It was the news I was listening to this morning on the radio. Today's programme was dominated by one person has come over on a boat for a second time and so on. And this is Radio 4 today. The third worry is association of worries about crime and violence. Often about local crime, but it goes all the way through to war. So you can characterise these really very sort of simply. The first one is, will I get by? Will my children get by? Will my family get by? Will my neighbours get by? Do we have enough money? The second is, am I needed? Am I wanted? Is there a place for me? Is there something I can do? The third is, am I safe? Geographically, these vary enormously. Countries on the edge of a country at war is a much bigger worry than it is for countries that are far away from war. And the fourth set of worries are cradle-to-grave issues. Healthcare, taxes, education, social costs, and so on. In China, incidentally, that fourth worry is the first worry. China is a very unequal society. It has an inequality index for income as bad as the United States. But as yet, people in China, on average, don't tend to worry about economic inequality because almost everybody is so dramatically better off than their grandparents. And there's a plan. There's a 5-year plan. People tend not to worry about unemployment, again, because there's a plan. People in China tend not to worry about war because there is a plan not to go to war, is my assumption. If you look at the number of wars that China has started, it's not very many. So why cradle-to-grave issues? Healthcare. Healthcare is the number one concern in China. Ageing population, but also a health system that may not be able to cope with that, and a question of how you navigate in that health system. And then, only when you get to number 5, and they only get climate change up to 5 by amalgamating all these other ones, do you get climate change being something that people mention in their top 3. And it's falling over time. Right? We have got a little bit tired of it. If you think this is slightly odd, the UK, we're the least sceptical in the world about climate change. Only 9% of people in the world believe it's a hoax. For questions later, it's absolutely fine if you want to talk about it being a hoax, and we'll be really sympathetic because you'll be in a minority of 9%. But there are a lot of people in the world who don't believe it's happening or is significant. Or more importantly, their real actual worries in life are more important. And this is the world's middle class. This is the best of 4 billion people. And lastly, because I'm a geographer, I managed to amalgamate everything to get biodiversity in, and the 6th biggest extinction of species, which you might say is actually the biggest long-term crisis, because you can't bring species back. But it isn't on the top of people's minds. Geographical differences between countries. This is all about how the USA does really, really badly, in case you were not aware. The first graph is from the Atlantic magazine. It shows that if you're aged between 20 and 40, you're about 4 times likely to die in any year in the USA than you are in comparable rich countries. Incredible difference. The middle graph is life expectancy by percentile. It appeared in the Financial Times. I've got old and boring in my old age. I did 20 years of collecting my own data. Really hard work. I finally worked out you just find somebody else who's done it better. Anyway, that's the Financial Times graph. The top 1% in the USA, richest people on the planet, are living to about 86 years on average. The same as the top 1% in England. And we're doing really bad compared to almost everybody else in Western Europe. Right? This is kind of good news. It's not even in the interests of the very well off to have very unequal countries. If you didn't know, I'll show you later, the UK is the most economically unequal country in Europe, give or take Bulgaria. Lastly, life expectancy over time, and the USA is at the bottom, and you can see it handled the COVID pandemic particularly badly out of those countries. So lots of crises. I'm jumping. I want to show you this graph. I've stuck this graph in. I don't normally show it, but I think it matters. And I don't like this kind of graph normally, but it's a lovely example of why it makes sense to draw a graph like this. It's showing you the votes from the general election, early summer 2024, to roughly 12 months later, the latest data they have. And it's actual people being followed by the British election study over crises. This isn't particularly geographical. We could make it very geographical. I think this is unprecedented. Labour have managed to lose half their support in 12 months after an election. And Labour's support wasn't great at the election. It was a few percentage below 2019. If you follow the lines, you'll see that most of the Labour support has gone to I don't know what I'm going to do, or Liberal or Green. And that's before Zach Walensky. Right? It doesn't go to reform. Not at least not in one election. Liberals, despite their best election for decades, managed to stay the same net. Lots of movements, but the same size roughly. Greens got bigger. I'm jumping over the nationalist parties. The Greens have got bigger, and they've got much bigger recently. But we don't know what's going to happen. Don't knows have got a little bit bigger. The grey don't knows, by the way, are underestimated. People really don't like saying they don't know when they're asked what they're going to do. In reality, the can't be bothered don't know is much higher than the actual really, don't knows. And a whole chunk of the don't knows have gone off to reform. Reform doubled in just 12 months. And you can see they've picked up, if you can follow the lines, they've doubled by taking Conservative voters from the last election. An election the Conservatives did really, really badly at. And have then in a year managed to lose so many voters. And they've picked up from the I don't know what I'm going to do folk. People who may not have voted in 2024. And then lastly, the Conservative Party. And if it's any solace to Labour, the Conservatives have managed to lose almost half their support from their historic low. Right? So it's not hard to point at things and find a crisis. If you like, that's our current crisis. An electorate who are more volatile than I suspect they've ever been, at least at any point we've measured their volatility. I would link it to fears about unemployment, broadly. Fears about too many people, that kind of thing, being stoked up. The third one, I just wanted to skip over these and show. This one I did actually draw by myself. This took ages. It's a sad map, but I just thought it really should be drawn. Some lovely researchers in Sweden meticulously count every single death in the world related to war. And the detailed map is showing you all the countries of the world sized according to deaths from war. So if you want up until 2022. But the picture actually doesn't alter much if you take it forward. If you want a summary of who should be scared of that, it's a very unfair, unjust global geography. The people who suffered in wars are not the ones who are making the weapons, right? The people who suffered in wars are not suffering in wars necessarily because their own governments have decided to have a war. I'll just let you look at that. I won't say anything more about the geographical picture. But if you want a really simple reason about why it's worth having a subject like geography and doing really old-fashioned, simple geography, like just drawing a map, okay, a strange map. This is the picture since '89. Now, until the last 16 years, the picture on war was, in a way, quite rosy historically. Stephen Pinker published Better Angels of Our Nature at a point of historic low in war death, and then they went up a little bit after he did that. They are still historically fairly low in the world. Being an optimist again, and I might annoy you with my optimism, we have an abhorrence to war and violence now that is, I think, historically unprecedented. We really don't like it. I wish we didn't like it a bit more. I wish we didn't like wars happening in places where people are not like us and we appear to care less. I wish we cared much more about, is it our weapons being made in our country that are being used? But there's the geography for you. The fourth one, which includes political corruption, which is a big worry in many parts of the world. I think it should be a far bigger worry here. I just think we're so good at political corruption we don't even know it is political corruption. HS2. We call it, what's a polite word? Cock-up, sorry, I can't think of a better one. Wait. It's not, is it? You think, all that money spent and you don't get a train line. In any other country, that would be called corruption. Or COVID. You know, we know what's happened during the pandemic. So I'm just saying, just because people in a survey don't necessarily in Britain say corruption is a concern, doesn't mean we haven't got corruption. It just means we're very good at it. But I won't say anything more about the pandemic and so on. I feel a bit bad about this book. I thought I was so clever and I wrote this book called Shattered Nation and got it out first about 2.5 years ago. And then suddenly find that Reform are using the idea of Shattered Nation to talk about things being bad. So lots of things in the UK are currently very, very bad. But I'll run out of time if I go through them. Again, step back, be optimistic. This is my favourite UK graph. It starts in 1910. It's about how much money the best off had. The dark line is the best off 1% of the 1%. And it came tumbling down. Tumbling down to historic low in the 1970s. The UK was the second most equal country to Sweden in Europe. And then it goes up. And currently we're faltering. It's a high. We're kind of back to Brideshead Revisited times, in a sense. And for those of you who know the novel, apologies if you don't, Brideshead Revisited was written at a time when Lady Marchmont was getting close to losing the aristocratic home because her investments weren't delivering anymore. The difference is that this was at a time when the rich were getting less and less rich. We're currently at a point when that hasn't yet happened. But our inequalities are back to Brideshead, quantitatively. Other things to worry about. So this is our number 5. There's one way of looking at climate emissions. It's one of the few things that isn't just rising, it's accelerating. This graph stops in 2019. Of course, it goes down, but now it's coming back up again. It's one way of drawing a graph. This is tonnes in the world over time. I'm going to let you take your picture before I go forward and annoy you. That's okay. Right. Exactly the same graph. But now instead of drawing it in a conventional way, time is inside the graph. The amount is still exactly the same on the vertical axis, but on the horizontal axis it shows you how fast is it going up or down. And emissions have gone down. You do need to draw the graph a different way to see it. They go down when you have worldwide recessions. You know, if you want emissions to go down, you can't have a world with bigger and bigger economic growth. And we can argue about green growth and so on. And you could say there's a tragedy in that every time we have a significant IPCC meeting, in the years afterwards, it kind of accelerates. But anyway, population. I'm just trying to give you an example of the things I think are really exciting, and if we could just do this properly in geography, we could make the GCSE and A-level so interesting. The standard teaching about population is it's a runaway train. You know, we're heading to 10, 12.5, 15 billion. It's out of control. That was from some time ago. A lovely book written called After the Spike this year by a couple of economists from University of Austin, I think, or in Texas. Peak baby was 1990. There was a little peak when they had babies, but essentially the number of children that people are having in the world is in freefall. If you take it forward, then that drop after a maxima in the 2070s, or possibly the UN currently thinks 2080s, that drops fast down. Right? So we don't even know for our own species what our numbers are going to be within the lifetimes of the youngest people in this room. You could get really depressed about that, because if you realise we don't even know that, why do we think we know so much about so many other things? But it's a brilliant example of something where people used to worry that we were going to cover the planet in human beings, and that was going to be a huge problem, to now beginning to dawn on them that there is no sign at all anywhere of anywhere that drops below 2 children or below 3 going up again. Right? Not necessarily a problem, just really, really interesting. That's the population graph shown the other way. Let's go forward, just because I like this summary. Exactly the same graph, log scale. Only 3 things of great importance happened in the last 2,000 years. 1492 and turning up in the Americas. Bad news for people in the Americas. 1820, 1830, we're in Manchester. Okay, you can celebrate all the buildings around you, but you kind of know what was going on in the rest of the world that helped make it so big. And this is what Europe was doing in the rest of the world, slowed down population growth. And then most recently, this is choice, people choosing and being able to have fewer children. Really simple data, just the UN population data, shown on a slightly complicated graph with log scales that tends to scare people, but you know, an interesting story. Why have I put Greta and Elon there? Elon's into lots and lots of people, or people like him at least. He wants so many people like him that there are people like him who have to cover Mars. Greta's worried about other things to do with the planet. Last complicated graph, and I know I haven't got all these connected, but I do think this matters. This is public spending as a proportion of GDP since 1980 in all the major European countries, missing out Switzerland and Ireland because their economies are strange. Because of American companies in Ireland and pharmaceutical companies in Switzerland. It's very similar to a tax rate, give or take borrowing. So in a sense, this is how much money we tax and how much we spend. We are at a historical 70-year high for taxation, yes, but we tax less than everybody else in Europe. Rachel Reeves is about to do a budget. She's about to say it's all very tight, there's not much we can do. Here's some geography. Okay, Rachel couldn't do it immediately, but when you're taxing and spending the lowest in Europe, there is kind of one way you could go, which is not politically impossible given it already exists. I'm not sure if we're facing north, but it's not very far to go and have a look at other European countries. The spikes are the banking crisis in 2008-9, that's bailing the banks out. And then COVID 2020, furlough schemes and so on. But look how the difference. I would say aim to be Germany if you want a target of what kind of public spending you want. That's an extra £1 billion a week on your health service, not 350 million. And decent spending for state schools, so no need to use private ones. Oh, hardly any fees to go to university. Right? And that's just up to the black line. Right? There are different options. You can't immediately get to them, but you can at least be aware of them. And at the very top, Belgium, France, Finland, Norway, Denmark, right? These places haven't fallen apart because of their terrible policies of taxing high. Spain and Sweden have wealth taxes, so Norway had some. Zooming on to the end, I did tell you that things are bad. So here's 2 quotes for those who like reading and are still paying attention. Stephanie Flanders, John Byrne Murdoch, Financial Times, Bloomberg, our poorest fifth are poorest and the average poorest fifth in most of Eastern Europe. Right. We now know this. It's no longer something we have to argue, but it is a strange place to have got to. Okay. Last graph. Forget the complicated graph. I just want to concentrate on the bar graph on the side. And if you've got very good eyesight, you'll be able to read the names, but I'll read them for you. This is incredibly good news. Right? This is an incredibly good news graph. This is the end of the talk. I've got one more slide, I think. So I want to be positive. This is the change in the officially measured rate of child poverty in the most recent 7 years for every country that the United Nations UNICEF Centre that measures this has got data. Just in 7 years. And in Poland, you had falls of almost 40%. Slovenia, Latvia, Lithuania, Korea. If you think about Parasite, that film, or Squid Games, Korea, poster Far East inequality country. A drop of over 20%. Estonia, Canada, Romania, Portugal, Croatia, Japan, Ireland, Malta, Greece, Belgium. Huge drops, right? This is incredible. Don't get depressed about what can happen in the world, right? In the majority of countries measured, and by the way, poverty is falling in other countries too, but not measured in the same way. The rises are tiny. The yellow lines of rises are 10%, and they are Iceland, France, Switzerland, and Norway, which had rates so low, they had the lowest rates in the world, and they're still some of the lowest rates in the world. But you'll have seen the line at the top, okay? And we already had a high child poverty rate, and we had in those most recent 7 years a 20% increase. So, it's fine to be angry. In fact, you should be angry. In fact, the only reason we have this is because people aren't angry enough. If you do as I've once done, and you go to Norway, I went 20 years ago to Oslo, and stupidly said to people in a hall like this, congratulations on having the lowest child poverty rate in the world, people shout at you that it's too high and don't understand it's really bad, and children are still poor in Norway, which is why they have the lowest rate. Why do we have a 20% increase, or one of the highest rates in Western Europe at least? Because too many of us don't care. Going to skip over conspiracy theories, because no time. Skip over this. Conspiracy theories are fun. And here's my last slide. And this is optimism. I can be pessimistic. I can imagine all kinds of terrible things happening. All of us can. But remember, we've lived through that era since the 60s where, it's my childhood, I'm not that old, my entire social environment has been an environment of pessimism since I was a child. When I was very young, I knew that the nuclear clock was at 2 or 3 minutes to midnight. Right? Children are not stupid. We've lived entirely in a time of pessimism. And in this country, you've lived in a place which has managed to do the worst in all of Europe in terms of altering its relative position, in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of housing, the cost of housing, in terms of standard living, and in terms of poverty. But that's just recent. Why have I put up this? We tend not to notice the slow progress over time. These are the 10 commandments of the socialist Sunday school movement, which was a radical, subversive movement just over a century ago, where trade unionist parents and others deemed to be very dangerous would send their children to a socialist Sunday school, not to the kind of one I went to, where I had to colour in Jesus blue when I was 6 years old. The socialist Sunday school had these 10 commandments. And this was seen as seditious. And of course it was at the time, because, you know, we were a much more religious country, and how on earth could you have an alternative 10 commandments? I'll read them out and then I'll stop. Because my point is, what is seen as radical and seditious and extreme in one age becomes common sense later. Love your school fellows, they'll become your fellow workers and companions in life. Love learning, which is the food of the mind, and be grateful to your teacher and your parents. Make every day holy, good, do useful deeds and kindly actions. Honour good people, be courteous and respect all, bow down to none. Do not hate or offend anyone. Do not seek revenge, but stand up for your rights and resist tyranny. Be not cowardly, protect the feeble and love justice. 7. Remember that all good things on the earth are the result of labour. Whoever enjoys them without working for them is stealing the bread of the worker. 8. Observe and think in order to discover the truth. Do not believe what is contrary to reason and never deceive yourself or others. 9. Do not think that he who loves his own country must hate and despise other nations or wish for war, which is the remnant of barbarism. 10. Help to bring about the day when all nations shall live fraternally together in peace and prosperity. The most radical politics a century ago, absolutely commonplace. Although I was asked, in one school I went to talk to, they put this through their prevent officer to check whether it was okay for me to show the 10 commandments of the socialist Sunday school movement to children. Right, which is, and I was very courteous, and I didn't say anything. I said, if there's any one of those you've got a problem with, I'm happy to blank it out. Okay. Thank you very much for your patience. Please ask me some questions. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions? You should just raise your hand. First lady here. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm wondering, do you have any suggestions for how we can sort of nudge the dial towards positivity? Because if you look in the press and aspects of it, or you look in X, so how do we bring this narrative a bit more to the context?
Yeah, how do we make this more positive? Twitter won't do it because it's designed not to, and it's been moved not to since Elon bought it. I used to have 20,000 followers on X. I think I still do, but nobody reads a word I say anymore, right? And I tend to say positive things. So yeah, you follow Blue Sky, you get yourself off X, and that's similar with various newspapers. Just don't read that. Find something else to read. The younger people are, the more different forms of social media they're reading and observing. And although very large numbers of stories in social media tend to come from the established press, it's an incredibly more radical and positive news that younger people are reading. We can tell this partly because of how they vote. So under 24, they're generally pretty progressive, particularly young women, but also young men. But it's, just beware what it is you're injecting into yourself. Yeah, go on.
Well, sorry, it wasn't me so much I was worried about as the people who glued to those outlets. So,
yeah. It's really difficult. I tend to only worry when the people glued are younger, is the decision I've come to. I have a close relative who only reads the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, and only watches GB News, and he's petrified of small boats. And he lives high up on the hill in North Yorkshire. Yeah, but it's not going to help him, But it does help to explain, and people who have parents, grandparents here who will say, "But you don't know they're coming to get us." A little bit of humour, but just yeah, and you can do some, you can go back in history to how we treated people a century ago, coming from the east of Europe. But just being better informed. Also remember, something like 2/3 of people in the UK now go to university by the age of 30. Might not stay, but they turn up once. So we're a far, far more literate, confident population than we were. Trying to poison people's minds with fear, I don't think is going to work as well. And you can see it in the age profile of voting. And it isn't that older people are being stupid. I wrote a book on Brexit, and then I did 100 public talks in leave areas in the south of England, because most of the south was leave, which people don't realise. And the reason that older people told me they were voting leave was they were worried about their future of their children and grandchildren. And that their children were paying rent, and that their grandchildren had, as far as they could see, no future. So it's a laudable concern, particularly of a generation who, in their 20s, could get a mortgage, had full employment, in wondering what's gone wrong.
Okay. I think this gentleman here, and then...
As a progressive grandfather who swears by private eye for news and analysis, one of the fears that I don't think you had on the early slide was AI and social media itself.
Yes.
And that may or may not be a crisis, but I think potentially it's a crisis to come.
Yeah. I should do a plus for older generation. It's the 2,000 people who got themselves arrested recently to such a point that the courts won't be able to deal with them. The majority of them were over 65, so I shouldn't rely. We don't have enough polls yet of AI in the fear. I have a fear that it's a drug. That if you're anxious in life, and most people are, particularly younger people, it'll correct your emails. It'll do all the things your parents might do for you that you'd normally ask them. It'll do that. It'll tell you what to worry about today. It can become your friend. It won't just write your essays or your dissertation or your thesis. It'll do all your homework. So it is scary. I can't help thinking that it's not going to last forever, this current AI bubble. It looks like previous bubbles. The amount of money that's been invested in it is truly enormous. They're going to have to start charging a lot. So they're trying to get you hooked to ChatGPT now, because they're never going to bring back their investment. It's the only reason for GDP growth in USA is AI. So it all relies on getting people hooked and keeping them on it. And it doesn't appear to make people happier. It makes you appear superficially able, right? But it's not going to get you a job or keep you in a job, because you can get AI to write replies to quick queries from your colleagues. I think I can't yet get frightened enough about it. One of the stunning things about it is that for those of you who are being very careful about using paper cups, not plastic, and recycling, you do a couple of AI queries a day, and that's a far higher carbon footprint than any of the other activities you're doing. Those data centres use this enormous. And of course, the reason they all came over with Donald recently and dined with the King is that they want access to us and the data centres here, and there not to be legislation controlling what they're doing with the AI here. But it's a get-rich-quick scheme, fundamentally. It's a get you hooked to something that looks really clever. But I'm a university professor. I've only ever worked in universities. when I get things from AI coming up, it's just regurgitating the history of what I know. But that's because all I've been doing all my life is reading this stuff anyway. And it produces you a mid-range tutorial essay from an Oxford undergraduate that sits on the fence either way and looks plausible enough, if you don't look into it, to think it's correct until you begin to check any of it. But I may be complacent. It just seems... the idea that a technology is going to get rid of lots of jobs. Suddenly, we've had that so many times in the past. Fears that particular technologies will get rid of lots of jobs. If you copy edit a book with AI, you're not going to get a better book. If you look at it, you'll get something that at the surface, or put it another way, 7 of my recent PhD students have worked as intern in AI companies on their CV. So I've asked them what were you actually doing, and this is in different countries in the world, and they were sitting for a year receiving the answers from the AI and telling it how they felt about the answers. So it's programmed to make a 20, 21, 22-year-old feel confident with what they're reading. Right? That's a successful AI. That's what it's designed to do. But happy to argue about it later. I'm just think it's the latest thing and the latest worry.
Yeah. Okay, over here, yeah.
You mentioned earlier, obviously, about the inequality with the billionaires and multi-millionaires getting smaller. As a young person myself, I just wondered what sort of timescale and projection do you see for the future of that inequality? Is it going to rise? Is it going to fall? And how many years is it going to take?
Go back to the graph. I think we're at peak. I mean, it looks like a peak. It's been wiggling around. Certainly in the UK. These billionaires are in the USA. I don't know, our richest person in people in the UK kind of make a vacuum cleaner and then run away to another country. We don't have famous, really rich people here who have done something with a computer very much. So I think it's at a peak. We've done things like in Scotland increase taxation rates and income taxation rates to begin to bring it down. In Scotland we've reduced child poverty. Not we, they I should say, I'm not Scottish. Scotland has the lowest child poverty rate, by the way, in the UK now. So that's already begun. Various taxes have increased. We're going to tax farmers on inheritances over $1 million. This is all the kind of beginning of what you start to do when you turn the corner. That last turn was around about the time of the First World War. It was taxing people to pay for the First World War. It was worrying about the Russian Revolution. Once you start to become more equal, it tends to carry on because there isn't a logic that goes, oh, we've got to stop now. We've made the gap a bit smaller, but that's now nice. Once you start to say our secondary schools could be funded like they were funded 10 years ago, you can start saying, why can't we fund them like they're funded in France? Right? Once you start to say we can put VAT on these schools that only 7% of people go to, which is largely to exclude themselves from other children, then you can begin to say, well, what else could we do? Because most of Europe doesn't have these kind of schools. Not banning them, but just once you say that stamp duty is going to be higher on the purchase of a second property, why not make it a bit higher again? Once you increase council tax for holiday homes, as we started. So we've now got discussions about a wealth tax. And she may bring in a little one. She's going to have to raise taxes. That's on the cards. And that increases equality.
Okay. Any other? Go. Just at the very back.
You have to shout.
So basically, since climate change has been occurring for a long time, and countries like, for example, the UK, we had the Industrial Revolution, which contributed a lot to climate change. Is it really something that we have the right to say to other countries that are still emerging that they should care about climate change?
Okay, yeah. Given our responsibility, there's a lovely statistic, well not lovely, but there's a statistic about how many of the carbon atoms up there are British, which is much higher than our current emissions, because we dug almost all the coal that you could dig out economically, and we started early, and we had a lot of coal. So our historic contribution to climate change is much greater than our current percentage. It's, in a way, it's a really heartwarming thing that we have the lowest degree of climate scepticism in the world. It's only 9%. And that's because we had a political agreement between the political parties and Sky and the BBC that they weren't going to do the two-sided thing of, here we have the climate change scientists, and then we put somebody with their mad theories that it's not getting warmer. I can say mad now, because it's got so much warmer in the last 10 years. It really is getting warmer. So the responsibility is almost entirely on the richer countries of the world, and not on China, even if it's the biggest absolute emitter, because per capita it's only an eighth per person of something like the USA. However, the really, really, really brilliant news, and there's a graph I haven't got, but it's in the book, is climate carbon emissions of the top 1% of the 1% of the 1%, and then the 1% of the 1%, and then the top 1%. And you wouldn't believe how skewed they are. When people get really, really rich, what they do with their money is they fly around in private jets a lot. They don't stop still being happy. They fly. They get really big yachts, which are the most dirty things to move around the Mediterranean ever, and have individual carbon footprints that are off the scale. So don't think so much about the richest countries, because within any rich unequal country, it is the top 10% who are doing the majority of the polluting, and within them the top 10, the top 1%. So anything you can do to make people who've got the most have slightly less, the money that's redistributed isn't used in as carbon polluting a way. There used to be a theory that said it's fine for very rich people to have lots of money because it stops the poor polluting the planet, and I'll have my nice green estate. But when we actually look at the data on behaviour, we find that that isn't the case, particularly now that stoves that people use in poor countries are being changed so that they're not as polluting. And that is good news. It's not necessarily countries, it's particular people within countries. Or another way of looking at it, the number of you at the back who have a driving licence or even think of getting one is pretty low, historically very, very low. Many of you are never going to drive a car. You're going to need a world in which public transport is better. The countries with the best public transport in Europe have the lowest pollution, for obvious reasons that people aren't driving and polluting. And if they've got good trains, they don't fly. Right? So there's a whole set of things. The other thing worth saying is that the biggest supplier of solar panels and heat source pumps and all of that isn't from these rich countries. It is actually being led from China. And rather than always having a go at China, we ought to have a look at why is it that the Chinese state decided to actually do this. Whereas on the other side, we have the USA, with a president who doesn't even believe climate change is happening, who managed to get the USA and Saudi to vote against the agreement last week to try and at least do something about the 3% of emissions caused by ships worldwide that carry our cargo that we use. And that 3% of emissions from ships is the same as all the emissions from aircraft. The USA and Saudi Arabia are trying to allow pollution to continue. And we ought to recognise what side they are on and that they're in such a minority in the world.
Just here.
I'm interested to say that AI just regurgitates what we know. Most of us spend our life regurgitating what we know. and I think I'm a bit more... I agree with what I think you're saying about the tech bros and the horrors that are ruling the AI empire. introduced deep seek.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, great. But I think AI's more potent than you're maybe saying.
I could be. You could well be right. What I'm trying to suggest is that you could go back in history, not very far, and find things that we're worrying about each decade where we were really, really worried about it, and it was going to change everything. For mine, it was nuclear weapons. Okay, there was absolutely no way we were going to control this. And then somebody ran a model, a GIS model, a geography model. They took a census, took the population, took the government's published estimate of how many people would die if a nuclear bomb hit, and what was called the square leg attack plan for Britain, which is where we thought the Russians were going to bomb, and discovered that 30 million people would be dead or dying within 2 weeks. And within months of that happening, it was replicated by the security services, and we began to disarm. Multilateral disarmament began. 90% of the nuclear warheads in the world were removed. Still very, very bad, we've got lots. But if I had been standing here at the point before then and just said, I think it won't be game over, I think we might manage to get these down, and you never know. By the year 2025, we might not have used a nuclear weapon. People would have thought I was ridiculous at that point. And you could take a number of other ones. That there will always be one way it's wrong. And it could be AI, or you could have been standing in 1938 and talking about what was about to happen in Europe, and you'd have been right, and it would have been wrong. But in general, the number of times that catastrophe actually strikes is relatively low as compared to the number of times we think it's about to. And that's because we're really, really good as a species at worrying. You know, we are always... There's a lovely thing about where our eyes are set. If you eat other animals that run, you have your eyes going forward and you're looking to catch them, and you've got claws. If you're worried about being eaten, you have eyes that move slightly more around to the back of because something's going to come and get you. We're worriers. We're a pro-social mammal that constantly worries, mainly about what are other people thinking about us, because we have to fit in. You know, so I am worried you're looking at me. I'm worried about what you're thinking about what I'm saying. You're worried about why am I spending part of this evening listening to this slightly weird academic. Right? But we worry. And that worry has got us to this point so far. We're incredibly worried now about how on earth are we going to carry on with our cities and our societies and so on. I can see us beginning to ban parts of AI. I can see us saying you're not allowed to use this for school, you're not allowed to use this for university. I can see us worrying about it, about the mental health effects of it, and actually doing something about that. You know, very sadly, a confession to you just love. You know, you get adverts up on your Facebook or whatever if you're old enough to use Facebook and Twitter. My advert for the last 3 months has been my AI girlfriend. She's from Crete. I haven't yet clicked on her, but she says she knows all about me and how to make me happy. Right now,
she's going to invite you to Crete.
She's going to invite me into Crete. How the hell they know I like Crete, I don't know. Okay, but there will be people now entirely in their main relationship will be with the chatbots who gets to know them better. And at some point, their family are going to get really worried about them if they're lucky enough to have a family. We'll start worrying about our teenagers who've learnt nothing because they've managed to fool the school so far, but then have to sit an exam and everybody wants to know what went wrong. Yeah. The question is, how are we going to deal with this? We've dealt with addictive, dangerous things before. It's not easy dealing with addictive, dangerous things, but we have some knowledge of how to do it. If I was going to guess about AI, so I'm not complacent. I think it is a little bit like a very hard Class A drug that makes you feel good, but in the long term is really, really bad for you as a person, and is not going to be the Labour Party conference was apparently absolutely full of AI. Presentations on AI by people, none of whom had ever programmed a computer. Right? We're at a stage of waffle and hype about this that's very high. And I'm sceptical, but this could be the big thing I'm very, very wrong on. It could be lovely. AI could help do all the thinking for us and we just sit back and go on cruises. But we thought that about textile mills. You know, once you can weave cotton with a loom, that's going to create, endless leisure. Right? And it didn't. I don't think it's this big. It's mesmerising. It's like the Wizard of Oz. You don't quite understand what's behind the curtain, but out from behind the curtain comes something that looks so... The grammar's perfect. There's no spelling mistakes. It's like what a mind that has read all this material, actually from only 4 years on the internet. Okay?
Okay, but I can't evaluate your Class A drops as I've never taken any.
Yeah.
But I can, and you're worrying about people thinking about you. One of the consolations of age is you worry a lot less about what people think about you.
Yeah. There's a lovely happiness curve where don't listen if you're under 50. It kind of goes down as people age. People are pretty happy on average in their 20s and 30s. It's quite rough in your 50s when your kids are misbehaving and your parents are not their fault, and then it goes up in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And the incredible thing is that the highest rate of happiness as measured in Britain is amongst 90-year-olds. And this is objectively measured, British Household Panel study. Partly sitting around going, I can't believe I'm here still. But we should look at things like, it's a generic curve. It's a European happiness curve, like that. We ought to look at it and work out, how can we stop people being that miserable in the middle of life? And at least seeing that it's going to get happier should help.
I think we'll have to stop now. It's 6:10. So I'd just like to extend a very grateful thank you very much indeed to Danny Dorling. If we could show our gratitude in the YouTube.